The Bible talks a lot about sins will be passed down to the third and fourth generation, but through something called epigenetics, we're actually learning that traits are being passed down 3 to 4 generations. So they've done studies with essentially water mites or beetles, where if they are exposed to the smell of a predator, the next generation will develop armored heads. And they've gone into basically Civil War records, and they have looked at not just if your dad was in the Civil War, but if he was a prisoner of war within the Civil War. Basically, the life expectancy rates went considerably down for that man's sons. And so that's a whole new realm of science that's opening up that has just absolutely fascinating insights with regard to how stress is passed down. So even our mothers, their stress response was actually pre-coded in their grandmother's womb. So your great-grandmother basically was helping shape and inform the stress response that your mother would eventually have. So again, nurture versus nature, but a lot of epigenetics is fascinating. As a therapist, most people that come to see me are struggling with what I refer to as unwanted sexual behavior. So unwanted sexual behavior could be the use of pornography, infidelity, buying sex, sexting, essentially any dimension of someone's sexual life that at the end of the day they wish was not true. And what we know from so much research that's been done is that pornography, unwanted sexual behavior is really everywhere we look. We know that about 1/3 of all marriages will be impacted by infidelity. We know that about 57% of our pastors and 64% of our youth pastors either are currently struggling or have struggled. We know that about 2/3 of church-going men are looking at porn pretty consistently. One example was 1 year on one website alone, the world watched over 4.7 billion hours of pornography. So that's equal to over 5,000 centuries. So we are overwhelmed in this world with sexual content and sexual brokenness. But then when you begin to say, what is the Christian solution or the cultural solution to these problems, what you get is something that I just refer to as lust management or shame management. And lust management is essentially, this is the bounce your eyes if you're having a lustful thought about someone that you find attractive. Some people go as far as, slapping rubber bands around their wrist. So it's basically this suppression that if anything of sexual desire comes up, I need to suppress it. I just need to get away from it. I need to run from it. I need to ignore it. And if you're really struggling, the protocol then is you should probably get some internet monitoring on your computer. And then if you're really struggling, get into an accountability group, get into some therapy. And essentially what ends up happening is that people begin to see these internet monitoring devices as fences that they're always trying to go over or under in order to find porn. But a couple years ago, I had a friend of mine say to me, Jay, when I have been having the same conversation with my accountability partner for 15 years, something isn't working. And, the other side, I would say this is much more of a mainstream cultural connotation, is that it's shame management. And shame management, in many ways, I don't have a huge beef with. But their approach is that if you began to remove some of the shame and the stigma associated with your sexual choices, then you're essentially going to become healthier. I'm all for removing shame and stigma, but one of the things that shame management really misses is the critical task of inviting people to make meaning out of their sexual lives. And so after I saw, in many ways, the failures of lust management, the failures of shame management, I really began to get a sense of, unless we change this conversation, like radically disrupt the conversation, we are going to continue to consign men and women to a lifetime of futility with this issue. And don't know if you've had those moments, but just that sense of defiance in me that just said, no. Not on my watch. And so what I decided to do was to do some research as to what might be driving the sexual brokenness of our time. I figured if we could just ask people to tell us a little bit about their story and what brings them to their sexual brokenness, we could uncover a mountain of untold stories and in many ways position the difficulties in the foreground instead of the sexual brokenness in the foreground, and then work to overcome them. So I did some research on about 4,000 men and women. Really, really fascinating results. But what I can tell you from the start is that unwanted sexual behavior is not random at all. It is a direct reflection of the parts of our story that remain unaddressed. And to me, this is really, really critical, and it has a huge implication. It means that our sexual brokenness can be a roadmap to healing, not a life sentence to sexual shame or addiction. I think we've got so much of the way that we engage sexual brokenness in the church today completely wrong. We're inviting people to try and develop communities that they tried to manage their sin rather than nurturing a community where it's okay to not have to fake that you're struggling sexually. And so if we can put the problem in the foreground, that area of difficulty, that struggle, that sin, can actually have so much to teach us about the unresolved stories of our life. So what I would really encourage you to think about is, what would it mean for you to engage an area of sexual struggle with immense curiosity? One of the things that I love throughout the Old Testament is that whenever God arrives into a broken, hurting story, God asks questions to us. Does that not surprise you, that the God of the universe is asking questions with regard to the struggles that his people are having? So Adam, after he has just eaten of the fruit that he was commanded not to eat from, God shows up and says to Adam, "Where are you?" The question is not, bounce your eyes from that next tempting piece of fruit. It's, where are you? To Jacob, who has been struggling his whole life with issues of integrity, the angel of the Lord wrestles with Jacob and then says, "What is your name?" It's the question that he has been struggling to answer his entire life. And then to Hagar, the Egyptian maidservant who has just been immensely traumatized by the first family of our faith. She goes out into the wilderness where by all accounts she's going to die. And just to underscore, a wilderness in the desert is a safer place for her to be than with the first family of our faith. She's there in the desert, and it's here where the angel of the Lord asks her two of the best questions that I think any of us could ever be asked, which are, where do you come from, and where are you going? The voice of God, if you are hearing it, is full of curiosity, it's full of kindness, it's full of surprise. And so as you think about your struggles with regard to sexuality, sexual sin, orientation, if you are hearing anything of condemnation, anything of accusation, what I would submit to you is that is not the voice of God. Because when God arrives in the midst of broken and hurting stories, there is kindness, there is inquisition, there is a sense that the God of the universe wants to invite us to reflect about where we have come from so that we can join with God with regard to where our story is intended to go. And by the time we get to the New Testament, God isn't just asking questions to human suffering, God is taking on flesh. Flesh in the New Testament is this word that is sarx. There are two words that could have been used. Soma, which is basically a reference to the body being really healthy, the body of Christ, the soma, or sarx. And sarx is in reference to basically the body that can be killed. It's the body that is prone to disease. That's the type of flesh that Jesus takes on. And so if we begin to really think about where should I be looking for the arrival of God in my life story, it's not going to happen at your youth group necessarily. It's not going to happen when you are praising Jesus and feeling great about where your life is. Those are all beautiful, good things. But if you want to understand where the God of the universe is going to show up in your story, look no further than your brokenness. This is where God is pleased to dwell. So our sexual brokenness and our sin is not a barrier to our healing. It is one of the most essential bridges that we will ever come to know. And by the time we get to, in many ways, the end of Jesus' life on this earth, what the disciples really have to grapple with is Jesus has scars. Think about that for a minute. This God of the universe that could have eliminated any trace of difficulty, of struggle, of trauma, of abuse, this God actually allows his scars to be seen. And if the God of the universe believes that scars are important enough to bring into eternity, what is the implication of that with regard to our own lives? We need to be able to be in a community of people where we are able to talk about the scars. We are able to talk about the afflictions. We're able to talk about the sarks of what we are in. And it's really in the midst of scars, in the midst of brokenness, that we actually understand something of God's heart to us, which isn't just to eliminate any story of brokenness, but it's really to say, your scars and your brokenness, do you see it as beautiful? Because if you can see your scars and your brokenness and your sin as something of where the presence of God shows up, what are we doing to the world around us? We are making known something of the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And so if we are afraid of our own death, the stories of Good Friday, crucifixion, trauma, if we can't enter into our Friday stories of life, we're not going to be able to proclaim resurrection stories to our friends and to the culture around us. It's really critical that we get this not just from an evangelism perspective, but really from a perspective of this is what the gospel is all about. This God who finds himself incarnating God's own self in the midst of heartache in order to make known something of his love and his fidelity and his covenant to us. And so all that to say, would you look at your sexual struggles in a very new light? Matthew 5:4 says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." If you really want to find healing, may you be an adolescent, a man or a woman who is really able to find grief for your sexual story. And through that grief, may you actually come to recognize something of the kindness and mercy of God. So when we think about sexting, when we think about pornography, one of the things that we really need to think about is, do you actually feel free with any decision that you are making? Because when I spend time with people who are really struggling with regard to their sexual life, whether that's sexting, whether that's the use of pornography, one of the things that they really begin to talk about is their deep ambivalence. And so ambivalence is basically, I feel pulled that yes, I want to do it, but no, I don't want to do it. Well, part of the question would be, how do you resolve that deep ambivalence with regard to something like sexting? And so I was working with a woman once who basically just brought in the story of this person that she was dating was asking her for pictures of herself. And in that moment, part of what she started realizing was, I really want to be seen by this person. I know that this is something that would mean a lot to him. This is something that might move our relationship along, but there is this sense of there's something in this that just doesn't feel right to me. And so in many ways, what I would invite people to understand is that how many of our sexual choices actually do not feel completely free or full of desire. So when you begin to think about, it might be good to send a sext, but then what is the long-term implication that you have to deal with? Do you want this man or woman having a picture, a video of your body for an eternity? There are some people who, in more outlying cases, have had some of their sex uploaded to various revenge porn websites, and then it creates a whole other realm of debris. And so really the crucial question with regard to sexting is, do you want someone to have access to one of the most sacred and beautiful dimensions of your life? So one of the things that we know about sexual brokenness is that it's not random. There are family system issues. There are past histories of trauma and sexual abuse that really inform the nature of our struggles. So one researcher by the name of Dr. Patrick Carnes looked at the type of family system that you grew up in as being very, very shaping of the sexual struggles that you would find later on in life. And so Carnes's research really looked at, basically, did you have a very rigid family or did you have a very disengaged family? And what he found was that 77% of all people struggling with sexual addiction come from families that would be very rigid. And so when you begin to think about a rigid family system, this is in many ways when rules become weapons. This is if you say something or watch something that you know in your family you're not supposed to, you're either going to get a belt or you might get a glare, a gaze that is really intended to do you a lot of harm. And so if you were to think about this as kind of the Grand Canyon, right? It's really good that there are certain guardrails around the Grand Canyon. No one is disputing that structure is bad for children. But what happens in very rigid family homes is that these natural barriers to protect kids actually gets extended so that you have no sight of the natural world. And so the clients that I work with that come out of rigid family homes might say, you know, if I got a bad grade on my test, I would not be able to play with my friends for the next month. If some porn history was found on my computer and my parents got my internet monitoring report, they would remove the internet from me for 3-4 months at a time. And so what they began to learn was that if they made any mistake whatsoever, their parents were going to create a very rigid system around them. And so what ends up happening in a rigid family system is that a rigid family creates fertile territory for anger to emerge. Because on one hand, you might recognize my mom needs the house cleaned every single day. She needs me to vacuum the floors all the time. And in many ways, a clean house is far more important to her than actually knowing me. Or you might see that your dad has really strict rules around what you can watch, what you can't watch. And then you're in the car with him and he's checking out nearly every woman that he drives by. And so when you grow up in this rigid family system, you're seeing so many discrepancies. And the natural response to that is really a beautiful dimension of anger, of this is not right, this is not okay. But where is that anger actually going to go? Well, for many people, that goes into the realm of pornography, right? So why is pornography so appealing if you grow up in a very rigid and dogmatic system? Well, now you have one area of your life that isn't under surveillance. Why would you want to give that up? And so then when you begin to think about pornography isn't just about lust, it's also about the ability to find control, to be able to have my own way. Well, nothing else in the entire planet gives you the ability to get exactly what you want, especially if you're growing up in a family full of rules and regulations. The second type of family system that Patrick Carnes looked at was really the Disengage family system. And so one way of thinking about a disengaged family system is think about yourself in middle school. When you came home from school and had an inevitable hard day, who saw your face? Did you have a mom or a dad that actually said, when you left today, you seemed okay, but now something has happened? Because the reality for every one of us is that middle school is a prototype of hell, and you really go through so much bullying, trauma, insecurity about who you are. And if you do not have a family, a community of people who are really asking tough questions about how are you, not just how are you doing with grades and school, but how is your heart? How are your relationships? What are you struggling with? And so what ends up happening to people who are in disengaged family systems is that they have parents who might be more involved with their work. They might actually care much more about the golden child in the system, so they care a lot about your sibling. They care a lot about their sports, their performance. But when it comes to your artistic, musical talent, they don't really seem to engage it at all. And so that sense of disengagement really cuts you off. And what you begin to grapple with when you're in a disengaged family system is you realize home, comfort, security, being known is not going to be found in a family system. I need to go out looking for it. And so when you grow up in a disengaged family system, it creates really fertile territory for lust to emerge. And so as a therapist, I see this play out time and time again, where some of the difficulties, the traumas, the sexual abuse experiences that people have had, they have had no one to talk to about these things. And yet what begins to filter through their eyes is something like pornography, sexual hookups. And what does that offer them? It gives them a knockoff version, an imitation of something of what it means to really be known and to be seen. And so essentially what happens in these rigid and disengaged family systems, and you can actually have a family system that's both. My family was very rigid on certain things, but also disengaged emotionally from people. And so what you learn through unwanted sexual behavior is it creates this this invitation to people to actually resolve their anger and their lust. And so this is why I think it's really important that we understand that sexual brokenness, pornography, and Jesus both deeply appeal to the deepest longings in the human heart. Why? Because what is Jesus saying? He's saying, "Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, all you who have been disengaged, and I will give you rest." Well, what does pornography say? "Come unto me, all you who have been disengaged, and I will give you rest." But also that notion of anger, that pornography is not just about lust, it's also about power, it's about control, it's about anger. What does Jesus say? Jesus basically says, "You bring me your anger. I can handle it. You let me know all the injustices, all the traumas, all the difficulties that you have endured, and I will take those curses onto myself." What does pornography also offer? Well, it says, "Bring me all of the things that you are pissed off at in this life. Bring me everything that you are struggling with, and I will create a world where it will all go away, and you will be your very own God in this universe." So again, just back to those things, both Jesus and porn invite the human heart to find resolution, relief. Only one offers freedom. Choose you this day who you will serve. So one of the questions that I'm often asked as a therapist and an author is, hey Jay, what about virtual reality porn? What about something like hentai pornography, which is more in the cartoon animation genre? Isn't that better than going to a brothel, buying sex, those sorts of things? What I would tell you is that in many ways, VR porn, hentai porn, is the marketing department for sex trafficking. Essentially what begins to happen is that this is the nature of basically all levels of unwanted sexual behavior and addiction, is that it begins to start in ways that actually don't feel terribly wrong or egregious. And so you're thinking, I'm just looking at this, no one's getting hurt, this might actually be a cartoon, this is just a virtual world. It's so much better than pursuing a full-blown affair or pursuing, buying sex in some city's red light district. But what essentially pornography and virtual reality porn really begin to groom you with is this understanding that it is okay to use someone else for sexual gain. And this is really what we're dealing with, is what is the nature of what we are called to as followers of Jesus, but also good citizens wherever we live. Well, we need to have an understanding of how is our bent to actually bring love and kindness to others. And so what happens in so many genres of pornography is that you begin to get a sense that it's okay to begin to use this other person for my own gain. But when do you stop that? And so then what you find is that then you start going into a marriage and you begin having very similar connotations with your spouse of, sex and orgasm was basically about my own needs. I don't have to know anyone else. I don't have to do the difficult work of actually coming to understand someone else's body, someone else's heart's intention. I can just get immediate access whenever I want. And then you get into a marriage and you realize that's a disaster. And so essentially, what you have to grapple with all the time with your sexual choices is this moving me to a place of deeper freedom and deeper honor of other people? And what I think you'll find in so many cases is that you actually don't feel free when you're using pornography. So I come at it from a perspective of pornography is a form of violence against humanity, especially violence against women and violence against children. That sense of why we would need to see not just a woman on her knees, but multiple women down on their knees. Why we would need to see porn that brings in children or different levels of degradation. We have to grapple with why is our heart drawn towards doing violence and asking someone else to subordinate themselves to me. So on one hand, I think we do have ethical considerations that we have to engage with regard to pornography. But I think as it relates to the human heart, one of the things that you'll find in pornography is that pornography, VR porn, whatever it is for you, is a terrible shortcut in your life. So let's say you're having a really difficult day at school. Let's say you're having a really difficult moment with your parents or good friends. Well, how are you going to resolve that difficulty? Well, what most people do is they go to a substance. It could be alcohol, it could be drugs, could be pornography. And so what you learn is that anytime I get onto this major highway called life, once I get into some traffic, once I get into some weather conditions that I don't know, well, I always take an exit to be able to get off. So whenever I'm feeling anxiety, I go to porn. Whenever I'm feeling angry, I go to porn. And so essentially, you're taking a shortcut. And then the more that you begin to lean and depend on that shortcut, the more it reinforces that you are a deeply anxious person who's unwanted, no one actually loves you. And so this thing that you're saying, well, I have the free choice to do whatever I want, is actually a thief. the thing that you think you're free to pursue is actually the very thing that's robbing you from freedom, that's robbing you from meaningful relationships and knowing how to move through just the normal difficulties of life, like conflict, anger, and anxiety. So shame is just this intensely painful experience that something about me is unwanted. And if anyone actually knew my story, knew what I had been involved in, they would want to run from the hills. And so as a therapist, when I am working with people who are experiencing shame, they begin to hide their face. Their face might turn red. They begin to wiggle in their chair. And so all of their body language essentially just says, I would rather be anywhere else in the world rather than be seen by you. So shame is really about the eyes of someone else on you, whether those are eyes in reality or just the perceived eyes of others. And so when really smart people called neuroscientists talk about shame, they use the analogy of essentially a manual transmission car. And if you don't know what a manual transmission car is, I will explain it. So there is a gas pedal, there's a brake pedal, and there's something called a clutch. We have something called a sympathetic nervous system. And this is essentially, think of it as the gas pedal. This is what inspires us to just go through the whole world and see what we can find. This is, if you remember being a young child, you want to pick up a rock just to see how many bugs are going to be underneath it. When you see someone that you think is attractive or enjoyable, this is the part of our body's system that just says, yeah, you need to go get to know that person. You need to touch that person. You need to marry that person. They are going to complete you. So we have this sympathetic nervous system that is encouraging us, propelling us to explore the world around us. But we also need to have a braking system, right? Because if you only have a gas pedal and no brake, your life will be over before your drive is complete. So the braking system is basically when you think about a parent being able to say no to a child. So think about like a toddler chasing after this, like a red ball, and they're playing with it in the driveway, but then the ball starts rolling down the driveway into the street. The parent needs to be able to say, no, stop. And so what ends up happening is when we experience shame, essentially what's happening is that that brake is being slammed without the clutch being applied. And what happens in a manual transmission car is that if you're slamming on a brake without a clutch, the engine is gonna kind of go forward and the car is just gonna rock. And that shearing off effect is what the neuroscientists say is what we are experiencing with regard to shame. So when you begin to think about your own shameful experiences, maybe you saw an image that you found beautiful, that you were really intrigued by. Your sympathetic nervous system is going to say, go find it. Find everything. One image is not enough. Find 1,000. But then if you are in a family system or in a church tradition that does not like sexuality, and this goes back as far as someone like Augustine, who was a sex addict by many accounts. There is generations and generations, hundreds and thousands of years of church history that has been all break without any honoring of just the human system to want to go and explore the world. And so what happens in these faith traditions and families is that that break is applied. So maybe you looked at porn or someone saw your internet monitoring and then they gave you a massive consequence. They made you feel like there was something about you that was perverse. There was something about what you chose that is going to ruin the next 20, 30 years of your life. And so what happens within shame is that we begin to feel that shearing off effect. And we really begin to feel like there's something not just about the behavior that I did that is wrong, but there's something about me that why would I be drawn to this to begin with? And so it's a really, really crucial thing that you begin to understand what is your own experience of shame. When you begin to think back into recent memory or many, many years ago, which stories in your life do you actually feel a great amount of shame around? And so part of what I would say is that if you want to disempower shame, you have to begin to turn and face it. So what do I mean by facing shame? One of the stories that I read in the last couple years that I loved was taken from an interview with a guy by the name of Andy Casagrande. Highly likely you don't know his name, but you might know his show. He's got the show called Shark Week on the Discovery Channel. So essentially, Andy gets in the waters with these great white sharks, and he was interviewed and said, you don't have a cage. You're free diving. What in the world are you doing? What do you do when there's a great white shark that's about to eat you? Andy thinks about it for a minute and then says this. He says, it's really counterintuitive, but when that shark begins to swim at me, I swim in the same direction as the shark with the camera. And what he says is that shark will actually bonk its nose against the camera lens, and then it begins to have this fear response in the amygdala that basically says, I don't know what this thing is that's swimming at me. Everything in the whole entire ocean as a great white swims away from me. What is this? And so what ends up happening is the shark doesn't know what it is, so it swims off in fear. And what Andy goes on to say is this really pivotal sentence. He says, if you do not act like prey, they will not treat you like prey. And to me, that has so much to do, that has so much to teach us about the nature of shame in our lives. All of us have great white memories. All of us have great white behaviors that we are trying to swim away from. And yet what you find is that the more you try to swim away from shame, the more that it's going to eat you alive, the more that it's going to basically affect the trajectory of your entire life. But what we can do with shame is to actually begin to face it. We can bring other people in to say, this is the shame that's coming up in my life. These are some of the behaviors, these are some of the experiences that I've had that if I'm honest, I feel like I'm really dirty. If I'm honest, I feel like this struggle is going to stay with me for my entire life. And what happens when we swim at the shark of shame in community with other people who are also swimming at their own sharks, is that we create a community where it's safe, it's good to begin to talk about our struggles and the difficulties that we face. And the more that you swim in the direction of shame, the more that you will come to disempower it. So there's this really fascinating story in the Old Testament that's essentially the people of Israel are dying. There's all these poisonous snakes that are basically, biting the people of Israel, and then they all end up dying. So then the people of Israel complain to Moses, and they essentially say, would you just pray to God to get rid of all these snakes? And Moses goes and appeals to God and says, all these people are dying. Is there anything that you could do? And God's remedy is, to me, really comical. God's remedy tells Moses, get a bronze serpent, plop it on top of a flagpole, and then raise it up. And when the poisoned Israelites are about to die, when they look at this bronze serpent, they will be healed. So the allegory is fairly simple, that the people of Israel must look at the very thing that is killing them. The Gospel of John picks this up in John 3:15, where it says, just as Moses lifted up the rod in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up in order for people to be saved. And so it's this notion that the more that we begin to see our violence, our violations, our difficulties, the shame and miserable experiences in our life, the more that we're able to look at them, not run away, not hide them, we actually come to understand more about the nature of power, the nature of resiliency. And so that is what I would say is find a community of people where you can swim at the shark of shame and really not live your life as prey to those accusations. Because the more that you feel the accusations of shame, guess what's going to happen? well, the more that you're going to pursue evidence that confirms your core belief about yourself. So if I think I'm a really sexually broken man, and I say that with contempt, if I think I'm really dirty, there's something about me that's egregious, there's something about me that's wrong, unwanted, guess what begins to happen to the human heart? We begin to pursue more and more evidence to confirm our judgments about ourselves. And so in many ways, our unwanted sexual behaviors are not an attempt to self-medicate. They are not to find relief. Far more, they begin to pursue evidence in the court of law that indicts us for why we will always struggle with this. And so the more that we swim at shame and bring kindness to shame, the less of an allure that we're going to actually pursue evidence that confirms that shameful belief about who we are. Many of us remember those conversations that we had with our own parents that, maybe our dad handed us a book, maybe there was this long extended 100-minute conversation. Part of what I would invite you as parents and educators and leaders into is what would it mean for you to have 100 one-minute conversations with your kids about sex rather than just one 100-minute conversation. What my research showed was that only around 5% of people struggling with compulsive sexual behavior actually had a helpful conversation with their fathers about sex. That number went to 8% of people struggling with unwanted sexual behavior actually had a helpful conversation with their parents about sex. And so here's the really painful dilemma for each of us as parents and leaders. Where we fail to educate our children, pornography will. That's the two-choice dilemma in front of us, is do you want some of the most sacred, beautiful, compelling, confusing conversations that you will ever have to be outsourced to someone in middle school or to the pornography industry? And if there's something in you that says, no, I know my adolescence peers and I don't want that kid telling them about sex, I don't want porn educating, well, that becomes the really pivotal invitation to you is what would it take for you to actually be someone who can be an educator to your kids about sex. And these conversations really need to happen much earlier than you would ever expect. So what we know from some of the research is that the average age of initial exposure to pornography could be between the ages of 7 to 9 for boys or somewhere in the range of 8 to 10 for girls. So it's way younger than you would ever experience. And again, if you have not invited your children to a sense of language with regard to what illicit images are, if they don't have any experience of being able to talk about their bodies in ways that they can actually say penis, they can say vagina, they can say vulva. If your kids don't know how to use proper names, they're not going to be able to tell you about things that they have seen or things that they have experienced. And so what often comes up for parents is really this sense of confusion, but also condemnation. So none of us have a clean sexual slate. When you begin to think about your own unwanted sexual behaviors that you were involved in as an adolescent, in college, or currently to this day, many times that accusation begins to flare up within us, and we think, I don't really have much of a right to talk to my kids because this has been a struggle for me that I have never been able to engage. And so essentially what kids are always doing to us as parents is cornering us with dimensions of our own life story that we have not engaged. And so part of what I would invite you to is before you have that conversation or those series of conversations with your children, will you do the really difficult an iterative work to really begin to understand something of your own sexual history and your own sexual shame. Shame and contempt, what I would say is like contempt is very similar to smoke and fire. So if you have fire, you're going to have smoke. If you have smoke, there's the presence of fire. And so what happens for a lot of parents is they have this internal fire of contempt around their own sexual history or around their current sexual struggles. And so what ends up happening is instead of turning to find healing for those stories, they actually bring all that smoke and all that nervous, anxious energy to their kids of, you can't struggle with this is going to afflict you for your entire life. Well, what are they saying? They're saying that I have an unresolved story that I haven't known the kindness of God in, I haven't known community in, and I haven't known that in many ways my brokenness can be a roadmap to healing. And so the more that you as a parent recognize that you are the one who needs to change the most, not your adolescent, the more that you really grapple with a lot of people in this world need redemption, but no one more than my own heart. And so if you can begin to engage that energy, know something of the kindness of God through therapy, through your church, that will create a very, very different energy with which you engage these conversations with your kids. Because what your kids need to know is that sex is not a bad word. It's not a dirty word. It's one of the most beautiful words that they will ever be able to speak. And so if there is something in you that feels highly confused, or a lot of judgment, I would say, what would it mean for you to do that work, to become educated and to become whole? Because part of what we're grappling with in so many countries across the world is that there is no comprehensive sex education. So there are many of us who know so little about things like natural human development. We need a comprehensive sex education model that actually invites adolescents to understand their bodies and to understand the powerful forces that are at work within their bodies so that they can actually also grapple with what it means to honor God with their choices. And so that's what I think is really missing is we're asking people to honor God. We're asking people to just not do things, but we're not educating people with regard to what is actually playing out in their bodies. And so I think if we can really say, how do we commit ourselves to a really comprehensive, God-honoring sex education where people are really encouraged to know about their bodies, what's playing out? Because as most parents know, by the time you get to 30, 40, 50, 60, well, your own sexual desires are already changing. Your body's changing. Your sexual responses are changing. The amount of blood flow in your system is changing. And so what you want to teach your kids from a very early age is education. So instead of feeling like there's something wrong with me because I have an erection all the time, or I get later on in life and I can't get an erection, you don't want to frame those things as stigma. You want to encourage people to be natural learners about the bodies that God has given to them. So if we can really begin to change our family and our church culture with saying, let this be a really safe, enjoyable, good place to learn about the bodies that God has given to us, I think we'll do some pretty significant damage to shame. So sexual abuse, when I say that phrase, I'm curious what images come to your mind. For some, that might be, let's say a child predator in a white van that's cruising around a neighborhood to find a kid. That could be something like an egregious rape. But part of what I would really want to invite you all into is to actually say that sexual abuse occurs on a spectrum. On one end of that spectrum might be a rape or a child predator. But on the other hand, on the other end of that spectrum might be a peer or someone just a bit more experienced than you who is introducing you to something like pornography. And so just again, back to that key question of when you were first introduced to porn, a sexual experience, did you actually ask for it? And so for many people, what they begin to say is, well, I found my dad's stash of pornography next to his bedside table. And part of the question I would say is, you've got to grapple with, you had a father who left pornography in a place where any child with an ounce of curiosity is going to find it. So another way of saying that is you had a father, a grandfather, a grandmother who created a context for you to be introduced to pornography. We've got to grapple with that. And so when we begin to look at sexual abuse, we know that, my colleague, Dr. Dan Allender, says that the ROI, the return on investment that evil earns off of sexual abuse is just astronomical. When we begin to really look at the rates of sexual abuse in men and women, but then the ways that that goes on to create just a whole mess of debris in their sexual story, once we go back to the origin stories, in many people's situations, the origin story was their sexual abuse. So I want to talk just briefly about some of the components of sexual abuse that are really important to understand, and then to get a sense of how they go on to shape the trajectory of our life. So the first core experience of sexual abuse is that you had an abuser that connected with you. So before any sexual abuse ever occurs, before rape ever occurs, before porn is ever introduced, there is someone who has an understanding of your life. They might know that your parents were very rigid people or very disengaged people. And so my clients will talk about someone showed up in their life that showed them MTV or VH1 when their family wouldn't allow them to listen to anything outside of Amy Grant or Michael W. Smith. Sometimes that was a home that they would never have any electronics in, and so their abuser at least initially introduced them to Nintendo. So they have all of these experiences where they were maybe walking in, Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts, and their scout leader began to introduce them to flowers, began to introduce them to different things in national forests that they had never known or had language for before. And so the key point here is that when an abuser is first showing up in their life, it's gonna feel right before it ever feels wrong. You're gonna feel a lot of green lights, because why? In many ways, an abuser mirrors the nature of God, which moves into vulnerability to bring kindness and the experience of being known. And so in many ways, the first stages of what is called the grooming process is someone saying, hey, Jay, you have a really great arm, or hey, that's a really nice dress, or whoa, you are such a talented singer. And so what ends up happening is that your body begins to feel like, whoa, it is so good to be seen in the midst of the desert of life that I'm living. What happens next is something that's really difficult to name, and that is, it's very likely that in the context of your sexual abuse, you knew dimensions of pleasure and arousal. And this is really difficult to name, but every abuser is fundamentally working for your pleasure, even if it begins to move into a place where you are deeply harmed. Why? Well, an abuser wants to make you feel complicit in your own abuse. Are you complicit? Are you responsible? Absolutely not. But they want you to feel that there was something in me that actually wanted to see this porn. There was something in me that actually wanted to see this babysitter's breasts. There was something in me that was actually really intrigued about what this sexual experience would be. Or when I saw that erect penis, there was something in me that was intrigued. And so what ends up happening is that then you begin to experience dopamine, which is a really complicated neurotransmitter that you're feeling pleasure, you're feeling arousal, but it's also the neurotransmitter for memory. And so essentially what happens is the first stage is that you're bonding with someone, you're connecting with someone. The neurotransmitter associated there is oxytocin, which is, basically when a mother gives birth to a baby, her body's going to flood with oxytocin, which is bonding. So as abuse moves in the grooming process, you feel oxytocin, then you feel a level of dopamine, you feel a level of pleasure, motivation. But then what happens next is then the abuser in some ways is going to ask for your secrecy. They're going to say, this is just our little secret, or we only do this when we're together. We don't tell your mom, don't tell your dad about this. And so what ends up happening is you've just had this really intimate experience with someone, but now all of a sudden you have to keep it a secret. No one else can know. And so some abusers might actually use a threat where they'll say, I will ruin you or your family if you let any of this be known. And so you feel like you're under stress, which is essentially cortisol. And so just to begin to think about what's flowing through your system, you have oxytocin and bonding, you have pleasure and arousal, but then you also have stress, and you have adrenaline and noradrenaline and catecholamines going through around what if someone finds out about this. And then the last stage is really you begin to feel a sense of shame. Maybe someone got the sext, someone abused you, you didn't really want to send that sext, but you went through with it anyway, and then you had a breakup, and then you begin to feel just that level of shame. Like, how could I have done that? What's he or she going to do with the footage that they actually have? And so what I want to underscore is that sexual abuse creates such an awful sexual cocktail for all of us. And so what will happen to you later on in life is that if that is your sexual template, so again, an experience that's bonding, an experience that is pleasurable, but also an experience where you need to keep secret, but then also an experience where you're going to feel shame in the aftermath of all that happened, guess what becomes normative for you? Well, you're not going to feel sexually alive unless you're recreating those storylines. And so when you think about, yourself maybe married 10 years from now, well, what's going to be sexually arousing might be your spouse, of course, but also you're going to want to find another experience that recreates something of that. So when you think about something like an extramarital affair, what happens there? Well, I might be in a toxic marriage, difficult marriage, just a normal marriage that's going to have heartache and emptiness within it. Well, then I'm going to start looking for someone that makes me feel good. So they're going to connect with me. Oh, I love how you talk about things. I love your interest in this certain subject. I love how you comb your hair. So their affair partner, before they start having an affair, is going to comment on something. They're going to feel good. They're going to feel oxytocin. And then they might exchange a text, a flirtatious text. They might start emailing. They might kind of go talk to their coworker a lot more than they maybe should. And so what are they experiencing? Dopamine, pleasure. And then what happens next is they realize no one else can know this story. If anyone finds out about what I'm doing, then I would be in deep trouble. And then they have the affair, or we could change affair partner to pornography, and you indulge in porn, you have an affair, and then what are you going to feel in the aftermath of all that? You're going to feel shame. You're going to feel judgment. And what happens in a lot of Christian communities is that we ask for people to have integrity with their sexuality. We ask for people to hold themselves to a particular moral standard, and yet we have done absolutely nothing to invite them to understand not just their sexual sin, but far more, where have you been sexually sinned against? Because the ways that we have been sexually abused and sexually sinned against are going to shape the trajectory of our sexual life in terms of what we find normal, what we find erotic, what we find appealing. And so as you begin to think about your own experiences, who introduced you to pornography? Was it your choice? Where did you find it? When you begin to think about maybe a weird or an awkward moment that you had with your mom, your dad, a babysitter, an uncle, an aunt, a peer down the street, when you say awkward or weird, was something about your body violated? Was something about your own choice taken away in that moment? And so if we can really begin to kind of say, what does it mean for us to turn and face the places of our own abuse, no matter what that spectrum is? Again, the introduction to porn or something as vile as a rape. What we can kind of begin to grapple with is that all of us have had experiences where our own sexual choice and someone's ability to honor our body and our sexuality was taken away from us. That's something that we need to learn how to talk about in our community. So when you are on the front lines of working with youth, you are going to hear particular stories. You're going to hear insights and windows into people's family experiences, to their sexual experiences, that most people on this earth will never have the privilege of knowing. As a leader, certainly as a staff position, if you hear a story of sexual abuse from someone in your church or in the youth group that you are leading, you are what is called a mandatory reporter. So myself as a therapist, as a pastor, I am allowed to keep confidentiality with almost everything that I hear. The only situations that I have to break confidentiality are when someone is a danger to themselves, meaning suicidal ideation, and not just, I don't like my life, but really, I don't like my life, and I have a gun, I have a bottle of pills, and this is what I'm going to do when I get home this evening. That's that sense of suicidal ideation and intent. I also have to break confidentiality when it comes to homicidal ideation, so a sense of someone wanting to kill another person. But the other experience that I have to break confidentiality in, and that I am a mandatory reporter, is when there is a story that I hear that involves the harm to a child. So that could be anything from neglect of someone's not getting enough food and nutrition to something of where they're hearing a story from a child of their own sexual abuse. And so that sense of, if you are working with a church, does your church have a policy for how to report sexual abuse? If you don't have a policy, pause this, talk to a couple lawyers, and get a policy in place. You need to have certain protocols established so you're not asking the question and Googling certain information. Your staff needs to have protocols to follow when you hear that a child is being harmed. So one of the things that we really have to grapple with is that we are in a culture that in many ways sanctions things like sexting. There are kind of various articles and publications, well-known teen publications, that actually encourage people for how to look their best for their boyfriend or girlfriend when they send a message. They leave it a little bit ambiguous, but all you have to do is connect the dots as to what they're saying. So just to underscore, it's a very, very high likelihood that you or someone that you know has sent or received a sext. Is that grounds for eternal punishment? No. This is part of what it means to grapple with the ways that our culture has really groomed us and has influenced us to do things to our bodies and to the bodies of other people that do not honor God, don't honor the other, and certainly do not honor ourselves. And so we have to create space to be able to say each of us have received and participated in things that do not honor God. They do not bear glory. And so what ends up happening when we have received a sext, sent a sext, is that we're going to feel a level of judgment and condemnation of, how could I have done that? How could I have asked that? And so again, just that question of, who are the people in your world, your peers, your mentors, your youth pastors, who are some of the people that you can share some of the stories that you don't want to tell? Because we all have them. And so when you begin to think about maybe receiving a sext, what my guess would be that you probably felt ambivalence, that sense of being pulled in different directions. Both, I want this person to like me, but I also don't necessarily want this person seeing and having my body on their phone. You might feel, I really like my body. I like the way that it looks and I want someone to see it. Oh shoot, I just made a really big mistake. Now we had a breakup and now I feel really violated. And so part of what I would encourage you to do is to begin to talk about the places that you are really harboring shame with regard to things that you have done. And so as we really begin to get into the nuances of those decisions, oftentimes what we will find is that there are so many people who didn't make a very clear choice. Just a really clear, yes, this is the best decision of my life. So when you go back to that experience of maybe sending a sext, part of what I would ask you to imagine is what were you feeling in that moment? Were you feeling excited? Were you feeling like you were in a bind? If I don't send this sext, then someone's going to be disappointed in me or feel like I'm a prude. And so just to underscore that almost all of our sexual expression and content has a level of ambivalence within it. And so if you are feeling like on one hand I wanted to do this, but on the other hand I didn't want to do this, this is a really, really important time for you to pause and to understand how that might shape the trajectory of your life. Because in many ways, what you're experiencing with a sext is going to be experienced when you choose a life partner. It's going to happen when you choose your spouse. It's going to happen sexually when maybe one spouse wants to have sex and the other one might be tired or not. And so just that question of how do you resolve difficult, ambivalent binds that you are in. This is one of just the very difficult, maddening aspects of adolescence, is that you are asked to work through immense, difficult moments and relational dynamics before you actually have a fully developed brain. And I say that not to insult you, but the male brain is not fully developed until you are 26 or 27 years old. So if you're thinking about sending a text, a sext, to someone that doesn't have a fully developed brain, you need to think about this is not going to end terribly well. Or if you are an adolescent boy and who has this great idea to want to see your girlfriend or someone naked, again, we can bless that you want to see beauty. But we also have to ask you to contend with the reality that your brain is not fully developed and you might be making certain decisions that are not going to bear glory in the years ahead. And so that just that critical task of how do you work through that sense of ambivalence? I want to ask, I don't want to ask. And so really, there's this phrase that we use in psychology, taken from a philosopher that basically said, ethics begins in the face of the other. And so when you begin to think about the faces of others, whether you are an adolescent boy or a girl, part of what it means to be a Christian is that we think about the faces of other people. Is this decision moving them to greater glory? Is it moving them to greater appreciation of their body? Is this have a long-term gain to them? Or is this something that is actually going to be something of a petri dish of shame to them later in their life, a week later, an hour later? And so that's really the ethical dilemma before us is, on one hand, I want to see, I want to send, I want to receive. But on the other hand, does this actually help me honor and move this person to a place of greater beauty and greater glory with regard to their life? So when we think about something like masturbation or viewing pornography, what usually comes up within us is that we need to stop doing something. So we need to suppress it. We need to manage it. I want to invite you to a very counterintuitive approach for a minute. So I want you to imagine your sexual life as a house. So let's say it's late in the evening and you begin to hear that familiar knock of lust come to your door. What are you going to do? Many people try to develop some type of Christian force field around their house. They basically get their internet monitoring, they try and say no, they try and pray, they try to maybe even call a friend for backup. Again, not against most of these things, but the other approach is that a lot of people just let the intruder come into various rooms in their house and just ransack the whole house. And then before long, that kind of thing that you did occasionally is now a habit, and now it's an addiction, and now you have a full-time squatter living inside your house that you don't know how to kick out. I want to invite you to a third way. What if you met that lust? What if you met that fantasy? What if you met that porn search out on the front porch of your life, and you began to ask it questions like, why is it that I keep going back to this pornography search? What is it about this person that I keep masturbating to? Because the nature of what Psalm 139 says is what? God already knows our hearts. God knows our thoughts, our fantasies, before we have ever entered them. And so when we look at something like Romans 12:2, what does that verse say? It says, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Well, you can't renew your sexual mind if you don't understand your mind to begin with. And so part of what I would invite you into is don't think about this as, no, don't do it, this is bad. And don't think, I can just engage in anything I want to as if it doesn't have meaning. Interrogate your fantasies. So what moves you to orgasm? What are the themes within pornography, within sex that actually have bound your heart to those searches, to those fantasies? And when we can begin to ask questions, when we can interrogate our lust, what we'll find is that our sexual brokenness, the difficulties that we face, actually has so much to teach us if we are willing to suspend our judgments against ourselves. And so this is a very different approach. It's not trying to say no, it's not trying to quarantine, but it's also not saying indulge. It's about being deeply curious about why you are drawn to any theme that you are drawn to. And if you can do that in community of saying, I don't fully understand my sexual life, but I know that this is the theme that I keep going back to. This is the porn search. This is the fantasy that takes place in my mind when I enter into masturbation, and I'm aware that I begin to use someone else, or I'm aware that it begins to go into a place of violence, or I'm aware that there's something in me that doesn't feel quite lovely after I've participated in that. Those are really beautiful, good, and redemptive things to talk about, because all you're doing is building a foundation with regard to your own sexual integrity that's saying, I'm going to ask, I'm going to interrogate my sexual life with really tough questions in community. And if you can do that at 13, at 15, at 17, imagine the types of conversations that you're going to be having when you're 50 years old. You want to start now with being super curious about why you're drawn to these things, and recognize that if the God of the universe is not ashamed nor surprised of what you have participated in and what you keep going back to, why are you so ashamed? Because when God comes to find you, again, God is full of curiosity. God is full of kindness. Romans 2:4 says, do you not know that it is the kindness of God that leads to change? So if you want to see change in virtually any dimension of your sexual life, try kindness. So polyamory, the nature of marriage in any relationship is that your marriage and your relationship is going to be one of the most beautiful, life-giving realities that you have ever experienced. When you think about going for a walk with someone that you first meet, when you think about what it means to build a life with your spouse, again, it fills me with joy. But then I also have to be honest to be able to say, if there's anyone that I have argued with more than anyone else on the planet, it's my wife. If there's anyone who has filled my body with a sense of not just evangelical, I get angry sometimes, but really a sense of rage, of I want to make her pay. So just to underscore, relationships are beautiful. Relationships are some of the most maddening things you will ever experience on this earth. And so what ends up happening within every relationship is that there is going to be a breakdown. Someone is going to feel like I have higher desire for sex than my partner does. Someone has lower desire for sex. Someone has a higher desire for community and friendship. Someone has a lower desire. Someone wants to make an idol out of their career. Someone wants to make an idol out of their family. And so what happens within committed relationships is that there is going to be tension. There's going to be conflict, and conflict is not good or bad. Relationships are messy containers of transformation. But what ends up happening for most marriages and most people is that what do you do with the emptiness? What do you do with the anger? Well, for many people, that becomes pornography, right? Where if my spouse doesn't want to have sex, fine, let them just do what they want to do. I'm going to go into my bathroom and I'm going to have exactly what I want because my marriage won't give it to me. Do you hear the anger? And so then many marriages kind of move into a place of, our sex life is dead. If we're honest, sex is about as fun as vacuuming. It's really disappointing. And so what does a marriage do? What does a relationship do when they bring themselves into those really normal patterns of difficulty? Well, what happens in a lot of relationships these days is that people are moving into polyamorous relationships. And what essentially happens here is that you bring in another person, another couple, in order to spice up something of your own marriage or your relationship, because if you're honest, it's dead, it's flatlined. What ends up happening from there, though, is that then you begin to allow your bodies to be known and loved by multiple people. And then guess what you find for the couples and the clients that I have worked with who have entered into polyamorous relationships? Well, then that becomes boring. That becomes difficult. There are power plays between which partner is more attractive and which one is less attractive, which one has more network power, which one is less powerful. And so even within a relationship of polyamory, you're going to have difficulties. You're going to have power plays that begin to exist. And then for some of the clients that I have worked with, they have then begun having an affair with the person in their polyamory relationship behind the other couple's back. And so again, we have the same structures of infidelity. We have the same structures of secrecy. And so really just to underscore, the dilemma of every marriage, of every committed relationship, is that you're going to have to figure out how to work through anxiety, difficulties, expectations in the marriage. Marriage is a crucible, and if you don't allow your marriage to be a crucible, you're always going to try and outsource the solution to something outside of you. Again, polyamory, porn, it really doesn't matter. It gives you a way of freeing yourself from the tyranny of having to work through what it means to love another human being. And so as you begin to think about your own choices, your own fantasies, may you really have a level of incredulity, a level of suspicion about what you are choosing. Because east of Eden, virtually every decision that we choose outside of God, outside of being known, really complicates the plot of our own story. Virtually everything that we choose outside of God and community is going to lead us into greater exile. So in the Old Testament, what I put my trust in is going to be my shame. And so you who put your trust in idols, you who put your trust in pornography, you who put your trust in polyamory, your trust will become your shame. And so anything that you take that begins to offer you a shortcut to not have to deal with the crucibles and the binds of your life is eventually going to be something that fills your body with shame and then will reinforce essentially an addictive relationship with that thing or that behavior.